In the spring of 2018, a man named Dale Kress drove his white Colorado State University pickup down a gravel road in Garfield County and parked it at the gate of a 34-acre property that had been in the same family since 1943. He had his clipboard, he had his Extension Service credentials, and 22 years of livestock assessment behind him. He walked the perimeter fence in clean boots, studied the 12 alpacas grazing in the south pasture, made notes in a measured and professional hand, and told the woman standing at the gate that she was running what he called a sentimental collection. He meant it kindly. That was the thing about Dale Kress. He always meant it kindly. 4 years later, in the late summer of 2022, that same woman opened a letter at her kitchen table and read a number on a single page. The letter had come from a water rights broker in Rifle, Colorado, and the number it contained was 312,000. She read it twice. She set it on the table. Outside, she could hear the alpacas moving along the east fence, their low hums carrying across the dry air, the way they always did in the early morning. Hatch, her gray-muzzled border collie, raised his head from the porch boards and looked at her through the screen door, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said a word. There is a story connecting those two moments, and it runs through 12 animals that the Extension Service told her to sell. A well that had been capped and forgotten since 1948, and a piece of land that looked from the road like a hobby. If you have ever been told that what you were doing did not scale, that it was not efficient, that it was sentimental, this story is about what it costs to know the difference between what a system can measure and what a piece of ground is actually holding. Stay with me on this one. We are going to start at the beginning. Ruth Vander was 67 years old in the spring of 2018. She had lived on those 34 acres since she married Earl Vander in 1979, and she had run alpacas on the property since 1994, when Earl brought home a breeding pair from a small ranch in Paonia and said he thought the fiber market was going to move. He was right about most things he paid attention to, and he paid attention slowly and carefully, which is a different skill than being quickly smart. Earl died in 2010, 8 years before Dale Kress made his visit, and what he left behind was the property, 12 alpacas, a 1974 Ford tractor. Ruth was known in Garfield County for two things: her silence, which some people read as stubbornness and others as patience, and her willingness to keep animals that other people had given up on. The 12 alpacas in her pasture were, according to every metric Dale Kress's industry recognized, below registry standard. Their fiber diameter ran higher than the breed average. Several had been culled from larger operations and sold cheaply. Ruth had acquired them over a decade at prices ranging from $200 to $800 per animal, at a time when prime registered animals were trading for $5,000 and above. On paper, she had bought 12 problems. Hatch was 11 years old that spring, gray around the muzzle and slow on cold mornings, but he still moved the alpacas from the south pasture to the east pasture without being asked, the way he had since he was a puppy, and Ruth still trusted his roots. Dale Kress was not a bad man. That needs to be said plainly. He had a master's degree in animal science from Colorado State, a wife and 2 daughters in Glenwood Springs, and a genuine dedication to helping small operators run their livestock enterprises more efficiently. He had helped dozens of Garfield County producers improve their margins by tightening their herds, contracting with established fiber buyers, and eliminating animals that were depressing their overall clip quality. His advice had worked for most of them. He believed in it the way a person believes in something that has worked before. He walked the fence line with Ruth on a Tuesday morning. He observed the 12 alpacas. He pulled up the breed registry on his tablet, compared their recorded fleece scores to the current national averages, and made his calculation in under 2 minutes. He was thorough and he was courteous, and he looked at Ruth the way a doctor looks at a patient who has been avoiding a difficult conversation. "These animals are dragging down your operation," he said. "You've got 2 in here that are borderline, but the rest of them are pulling your clip average into the rejection zone for most commercial buyers. What you've built here, Ruth, is a sentimental collection. I'm not saying you don't care for them well. I'm saying you cannot sell what they produce at a price that makes sense." Ruth looked at the 12 alpacas and then at her gatepost and then back at Dale Cress. "Earl kept these lines for a reason," she said. Cress nodded in the patient way of a man who has heard this before. "I understand that. But Earl's not here to run the numbers. And the numbers say these animals don't fit a viable fiber operation. I'd recommend selling 12 restocking with 6 registered females from a production line and signing on with the Western Slope Fiber Collective. They'll give you a predictable contract." Ruth thanked him and walked him to his truck. She did not sell the 12 alpacas. Let me tell you about what Dale Cress could not measure, because it matters, and because it is not simple. Alpaca fiber is graded by its diameter, measured in microns. A micron is 1/1000th of a millimeter, and the difference between 24 microns and 18 microns is not a rounding error. It is the difference between a fiber that scratches and a fiber that does not, between material that can be worn next to the skin without a layer of cotton underneath, and material that cannot. The textile industry calls fiber, below 18 microns, baby alpaca, a term that refers to fineness, not to the age of the animal that produced it. It is graded separately, processed separately, and sold separately. And the mills that work with it are not the same mills that work with commodity-grade fleece on a volume contract. Those mills are smaller, more selective, and they pay accordingly. They are not listed in Dale Cress's Extension Service handouts because the Extension Service was advising operations that produced fiber for volume buyers, and volume buyers do not pay $38 per pound for 84 pounds of fleece annually. The math on that side of the market does not work until you understand that the price per pound is not the only variable. The breed registry standard that Cress used to classify Ruth's animals as below grade was built around a set of expectations for commercial fiber production. What the standard measured was average micron count across a herd, and what it could not account for was variance within a genetic line that had been selected for something other than commercial conformity. Earl's animals had not been bought from production lines. Several of them traced back to Bolivian bloodstock that had arrived in the United States in the early 1982 through a small importer in New Mexico before the industry had settled on the breeding priorities that currently defined the registry. Those original lines had not been selected for volume. They had been selected across generations at altitude in the Andes for a different quality entirely. Fineness of fiber in the driest, harshest conditions a mountain environment could produce. The industry had moved past them in favor of animals that produced more reliably, at a consistent grade. Earl had moved toward them deliberately. Ruth did not know for certain that her animals were producing fiber at that grade. She knew that Earl had thought so. His journal contained entries from 1996 and 1999 and 2004, in which he had recorded the fleece samples he sent to a processing lab in Ohio and the micron readings that came back. The readings ranged from 17.4. Earl had not told anyone about the readings because no one had asked, and because Earl did not talk about things he was still figuring out. What he had written in the journal, in his careful, narrow handwriting, was a single line. These animals are not below standard. They are a different standard. The buyers who cannot see that are looking at the wrong number. The other thing Dale Kress could not measure was the behavior. Alpacas, as a species, are prey animals with a sophisticated group intelligence. They communicate alarm through posture and sound and movement, and they navigate terrain using senses that operate well below the threshold of human observation. One of those senses documented in the academic literature on camelid behavior is a sensitivity to subsurface moisture. Alpacas in arid or semi-arid environments have been observed clustering over underground water sources, pawing at dry ground above aquifers, and returning repeatedly to specific locations along fence lines where no surface water is visible. This behavior is not mythological. It has been measured by researchers studying livestock orientation in drought conditions and by ranchers in the Andes who have used camelid behavior to locate springs for centuries. It is not magic. It is biology. The animal's hooves contain a dense network of mechanoreceptors, sensory nerve endings responsive to ground pressure and vibration, and their thermosensitivity, particularly in the padded sole of the foot, is precise enough to distinguish temperature differences of less than 2 degrees Celsius at the surface of the ground. The soil above a buried water source, even a capped one, maintains a measurably different temperature and conductivity profile than the surrounding dry earth, because water moving through rock at depth creates a thermal gradient that expresses itself subtly at the surface. A human being walking across that ground notices nothing. An alpaca standing on it for 4 days is reading something. The Andean ranching tradition has understood this for a long time. Herders in the Peruvian Altiplano have used llama and alpaca movement to identify buried water sources for generations, the same way other pastoral cultures have used the behavior of cattle or horses in dry years. The knowledge was never formalized into a textbook, because it was never the kind of knowledge that needed a textbook. It was passed from one generation to the next as a thing you watched for, a thing you wrote down if you were Earl Vander, and a thing you kept in the back of your mind if you were Ruth. Earl Vander had noted this behavior in his journal in the summer of 1962, when he was 14 years old and helping his father with the original herd of 4 animals the family had kept since the late 1942. His entry from that August ran to 4 sentences. They stood at the east fence for 4 days. Pa said it was nothing. Then the creek went dry and they were still going to the fence. There is something under there near the old spring post. Ruth had read that entry. She had read it in 2010, sorting through Earl's things after the funeral, and she had not known what to do with it. She had walked the east fence herself and found nothing visible. She had filed it in the back of her mind, the way you file a fact you cannot yet use. She had kept the animals that carried the behavior in their bloodlines the same way. Earl had, without fully knowing why, the way you keep a habit that feels right before you can explain it. In the late summer of 2019, Ruth's granddaughter, Megan, arrived at the property with a degree in agricultural economics from Colorado State University, and a set of spreadsheets she had built during the drive from Fort Collins. Megan was 29, with Earl's narrow nose and her own considerable confidence, and she loved her grandmother in the way you love someone you were also worried about. She had seen Dale Kress's assessment report, which Ruth had not thrown away, and she had done her own research into Western slope fiber prices and found that Cress's numbers were correct. Standard-grade alpaca fiber was selling at $9 per pound at commercial buyers, and Ruth's annual clip from 12 animals, at roughly 7 pounds per animal after skirting, was producing somewhere around 84 pounds of fiber. At $9 per pound, that was $756 per year. The hay and supplemental feed for 12 alpacas over a Colorado winter was running Ruth about $4,200. The math was not working. Megan had also pulled the property's county tax assessment and the water district billing records. Ruth kept in a manila folder in the kitchen drawer, and she had built a 5-year projection that showed the operation consuming roughly $3,400 more than it produced annually, against a property that was otherwise unencumbered and worth considerably more per acre than the agricultural use was generating. She was not trying to dismantle what Earl had built. She was trying to understand why it was still standing. "Grandma," Megan said at the kitchen table the first evening, "I'm not saying sell them all. Dale Cress is right that this operation isn't viable the way it's structured. If we could get you into a production contract with better animals—" "Your grandfather kept these lines for a reason," Ruth said. "Do you know what the reason was?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. She looked at Earl's journal on the table. "He wrote it down," she said. "I expect it's in there." Megan looked at the journal and did not pick it up that night. She went to bed still carrying her spreadsheets in her head, which was the way she always carried things she had not resolved. There are moments in a story like this where the easy thing and the right thing run in the same direction for a while, and the hard thing runs somewhere else entirely, and you cannot tell from where you are standing which path you are on until well after the fact. If you have been in that position, watching a conventional answer line up against a stubborn one and not quite being able to dismiss either of them, this is the part of the story you will recognize. 2 miles up the road, Nate Poole was running the kind of operation Dale Cress had in mind when he gave his recommendation. Nate had 40 registered Huacaya alpacas, a new fiber barn he had financed in 2017 for $185,000, and a contract with the Western Slope Fiber Collective that guaranteed him a base price on every pound of graded fiber he produced, provided his clip average stayed at or below 23 microns. He had put in a county water district line the same year he built the barn, a buried PVC system that ran from the district main on the county road to a frost-free hydrant in his pasture and a float valve in his barn waterers. The system had cost him $22,000 to install. His water bill in a normal year ran $1,100 for agricultural use. Nate was hardworking and careful with his animals and his books. He had done everything the industry told him to do. He bought registered animals, maintained his breeding records, sheared on schedule, and submitted his fiber on time. His clip average was 22.3 microns, right inside the collective's premium window, and his annual fiber check in 2019 ran to $18,700. He was not getting rich, but he was getting paid, and he had collateral and a plan. And when Megan met him at a Garfield County Growers event that fall, he was the kind of producer she had been trained to see as the model. He was friendly to Ruth and asked after her animals without condescension. He had $185,000 in fiber barn debt, $22,000 in waterline debt, and $14,800. His annual debt service was running just over $19,000. His fiber check covered it, most years with room for hay and feed on top. He was operating on a margin that assumed the water district would deliver, the collective's price would hold, and the weather would not interfere. Ruth's annual fiber check from her small lot sale in 2019 came to $731. The numbers were not in her favor. That was simply true. What happened in the spring of 2020 in Carbondale at the Garfield County Alpaca Growers Association meeting was the kind of moment that gets remembered differently by the people in the room, depending on where they were sitting. Dale Kress was the featured speaker. He presented his assessment of the regional fiber market, the collective's contract terms for the coming season, and his recommendations for herd improvement across the county. He was thorough and clear, and his slides were well organized. The Carbondale Grange Hall held about 40 producers that evening, ranged at folding tables with their coffee cups, and Kress moved through his material at the measured pace of a man who had given versions of this presentation many times and believed in every word of it. His data was real. His price projections were sourced, his recommendations had worked for the majority of the producers in that room. When he opened the floor for questions, one of the producers in the back row asked about alternative fiber markets and whether anyone was selling outside the collective to specialty mills. Kress nodded. "There are boutique operations doing that," he said. "But I want to be honest with you, what you encounter in that space is mostly people running what I'd call a sentimental collection. Smaller herds, often heritage, or mixed lines, selling to mills that pay more per pound for much smaller volumes. The math on that model rarely works at the scale. Most of you are operating." He paused and consulted his slide. "If your goal is a sustainable operation, production contracts with graded fiber are the path." Ruth was in the fourth row. She had driven in from the property that morning with Hatch waiting in the truck bed. She did not say anything. She looked at the screen and then at her hands in her lap and then at the window. And when the meeting was over, she drove home. Megan had been sitting beside her. On the drive back, Megan turned to Ruth. "He's using your operation as an example." "He's using what he knows," Ruth said. "He doesn't know everything." That was the most Ruth said about Dale Kress in 4 years. What Megan did that evening was pick up Earl's journal. She sat at the kitchen table after Ruth went to bed and read it, cover to cover, which took her until nearly midnight. She had been expecting sentiment and found mechanism. Earl's entries were not lyrical. They were observational, dated, and specific. He had noted fleece scores and feeding patterns and breeding outcomes and the animal's behavior during weather events. He had recorded in his meticulous columns of figures the cost per animal per year against the revenue per animal per year. And he had tracked those numbers from 1994 to 2008, the last full year he had worked the property before his health declined. The early years were unprofitable, the middle years were marginal. The later years, after the breeding program had run for a decade and the Bolivian bloodlines had begun expressing consistently in the clip, were something else. Earl's 2006 fiber check from a specialty processor in Ohio on 91 pounds of sorted fleece had been $2,940 against a commodity equivalent that would have run 819 gas. He had not told anyone. He had just kept going. He had noted in 2002 that 3 of the older females in the herd showed a consistent preference for the northeast corner of the east pasture on warm days, even when the grazing was better elsewhere. His note from that observation was 3 words: not shade-seeking. The corner is exposed, something else. Megan read the 1962 entry about the east fence. She read Earl's 1996 lab results. She turned to the back cover of the journal and found the folded map. She opened it on the kitchen table and looked at the dotted circle in the northeast corner of the east pasture and the penciled notation beside it, and she looked at it for a long time. She sat with the journal closed on the table for a while and then went to bed without saying anything to Ruth, which was, she would think later, the moment she began to suspect that her grandmother was not wrong. She lay awake running the numbers from Earl's 2006 fiber check against her own projections and found that the model she had built was missing a variable she had not known to include. The winter of 2021 into 2022 was dry across western Colorado. The snowpack in the Elk Mountains came in at 61% of the historical average. Skiers called it a bad year. Ranchers called it a warning. The spring runoff was thin, the creeks in Garfield County peaking 2 weeks early and dropping fast through April instead of holding into June. By the end of May, the soil moisture readings across the valley were running at levels the County Extension Office was describing as comparable to 1977, the driest spring on record in the western part of the state. By June of 2022, water managers on the western slope were in conversation with the state engineer's office, and by the third week of July, the county had issued mandatory restrictions that cut agricultural delivery from the water district to 40% of contracted allotments. The restrictions applied to all junior water rights holders pulling from the district system. Senior right holders on the river were curtailed separately through a different process, but district customers were simple. They got 40% of what their contract promised, effective immediately, with the restriction potentially tightening further. Nate Poole's buried water line ran from the county district main. On the 24th of July, his pasture irrigation went to 40%. His barn waterers running off the same line dropped proportionally. He had 40 animals to water in temperatures that were reaching 96 degrees Fahrenheit in the afternoon, on a day when the National Weather Service issued a heat advisory for western Colorado that they asked ranchers to take seriously. A Huacaya alpaca in summer heat needs approximately 2 gallons of clean water per Dalton Y at a minimum, more in the kind of heat that week was producing. Nate's system, at 40% restriction, was delivering about 1.3 gallons per animal per Dalton Y from the district line. He was short, and his animals were showing it. By the 10th of August, the restriction tightened to 20%. His water cost per animal per Dalton Y, which had been running at about $0.18 from the district, climbed to $0.67 as he began trucking supplemental water from a fill station in Rifle, a round trip of 34 miles in a 500-gallon poly tank in the bed of his pickup. He was making 2 trips a day with 40 animals in a dry summer. The cost of keeping them watered through September was going to run him an additional $9,200 on top of his fixed operating costs. He sold 19 head in late August at an emergency livestock sale in Silt. The prices averaged $340 per animal. He had paid between $2,800 and $4,500 for each of them. Ruth's well was fed by a spring aquifer that the county water restrictions did not touch. She did not yet know. She had a well. What she had was 12 alpacas standing at the east fence. She had noticed it on a Monday in early July, the first time the herd had gathered that way in the 4 years since Earl died. They were not grazing. They were standing at the fence line near the northeast corner of the east pasture, all 12 of them pressed loosely together in the morning heat, their long necks lowered and their ears forward, oriented toward the ground at the fence corner with a focused, patient attention that she recognized from Earl's journal description. Hatch was sitting 15 feet behind them, watching them the way a border collie watches something it has been asked to move but cannot figure out how to approach. Ruth stood at the gate and looked at the corner. The ground there was dry and cracked. Like everywhere else on the property, there was no shade, The grass was sparse and yellow. The fence wire ran straight and ordinary. There was no reason for them to be there. She watched them for 20 minutes. They did not move on. She walked back to the house and got Earl's map from inside the journal cover. The dotted circle was in the northeast corner of the east pasture. Earl had written beside it in pencil 2 words, 1948. Spring capped. Dale Cress made one final visit to Ruth's property in April of 2022, 3 months before the drought restrictions hit. He came to follow up on a county outreach program for small alpaca producers, bringing information about the collective's new contract terms and a brochure about a low-interest equipment loan program. He was, as always, genuinely trying to help. So, he walked the east pasture with Ruth in the late afternoon light and looked at the 12 alpacas and shook his head with something that was not quite pity and not quite exasperation, but held elements of both. "Ruth," he said, "I've been coming out here for 4 years, and I want you to know, I respect what you're doing. I do. But what you have here is still a sentimental collection, and the market isn't going to change to fit it. If you won't sell, at least let us get you into the equipment loan program so you can improve your infrastructure." Ruth thanked him for the brochure and walked him to his truck. On the morning of the 11th of July, Ruth drove a fencing stake into the ground at the northeast corner of the east pasture and tied a piece of orange survey tape to it. She came back the next morning and found the alpaca standing within 10 feet of the stake, humming quietly. Hatch sat at the gate and watched. She drove another stake 6 inches from the first one and used the heel of her boot to probe the soil. The ground was hard and dry to the depth she could reach, but when she knelt and pressed her palm flat to the earth, it was cooler than the surrounding ground by what she guessed was 8 or 10 degrees. She called Megan that evening. Megan drove from Fort Collins the next morning and arrived at noon with a soil probe she had borrowed from the extension office and a printout of Earl's 1948 property survey, which she had pulled from the county assessor's records. The survey showed in the northeast corner of the east pasture a notation in the survey hand reading, "Cased Spring Capstone 1911 Construct." They dug by hand for an hour, starting at the stake, and at 18 inches they found the stone cap, a fitted sandstone disc approximately 30 inches across, sealed with hydraulic mortar. Megan used a pry bar and Ruth used a garden spade, and they lifted it together on a Tuesday afternoon in July of 2022, and from the dark shaft beneath they heard water. The well was 34 feet deep. It had been stone-lined to the casing by a mason whose mark, 3 parallel chisel cuts on a single coarse stone near the top, matched a notation in the County Historical Society's records as the work of a stonemason who had worked the Garfield County Valley from 1908 to 1917. The stone courses were tight and even, the mortar still sound, where the water table had kept it saturated. Megan climbed down 6 feet on an extension ladder Ruth had fetched from the barn and held her phone light over the water surface and reported that it was clear and running, a thin sheet of water moving across the bottom of the casing from northwest to southeast, feeding from the spring seep the stonemason had built around. The water tested clean at a state lab in Grand Junction within the week. No coliform, no nitrates above the threshold. The flow rate, measured by a simple bucket and timer test, was 8 gallons per minute in Ute, sustained across 3 separate readings over 2 days. Ruth called Warren Cho on the recommendation of a neighbor who had dealt with water rights in a dry year in 2012. Warren was 58, a water rights attorney in Glenwood Springs. With a hydrology background that had started in a geology PhD, he had not finished. And he arrived 2 weeks later in a gray sedan and spent the better part of a morning pulling books and documents from his briefcase at Ruth's kitchen table. What he found was a water right adjudicated in 1938 by the state of Colorado under the prior appropriation doctrine. Prior appropriation is the system the western states use to govern water, and its operating principle is straightforward. The first person to put water to beneficial use holds the superior right in times of shortage. The date of your right is your priority number. Senior rights curtail junior ones when supply falls short, moving down the priority list from the oldest right to the newest until the available supply is exhausted. The 1938 right on Ruth's property was for 14.7 acre-feet per year from the spring aquifer feeding the well, and it was senior by decades to the municipal water district system that Napool pulled from, senior to most of the agricultural rights in the valley, senior to nearly everything that had been adjudicated in the post-war development years. In a drought year, when the state engineer was curtailing junior rights to protect senior ones, a right like that did not just hold. It became one of the last rights standing. In the western water market, where cities and agricultural districts were scrambling for secure supply in dry years, a senior right attached to a private spring aquifer with no infrastructure entanglement was a different category of asset than most small landowners in Garfield County had ever held. Warren laid the adjudication decree on the table, a 2-page document stamped by the Water Court in 1938, and let Ruth read it. "Someone called my office last week," he said when she finished, "a water broker out of Rifle. He'd seen the filing I submitted when I registered the discovery with the state engineer. The number he mentioned to me for an outright purchase of the right was $312,000. Ruth looked at the documents and then out the window at the east pasture. Alicia Strand, a fiber buyer from a mill in Burlington, Vermont, was out there with Megan, working through the fleece samples Ruth had agreed to submit. Alicia had driven the 1,900 miles from Vermont after Megan sent her Earl's lab records and the micron readings from the original Ohio processor, and she had asked if she could come and see the animals. She had not negotiated. She had simply said she would be there on Thursday, $312,000. Ruth picked up the letter Warren had brought as confirmation of the broker's formal offer and read it twice. She set it flat on the table with both hands. She did not say anything. Outside, through the kitchen window, she could see Alicia holding a pulled lock of fleece to the afternoon light, turning it slowly in 2 fingers, and she could see Megan watching Alicia's face for a signal, and she could see the 12 alpacas grazing behind them both, calm and ordinary in the late summer sun. That number sat in the air of the kitchen for a long time. Warren waited. He was, by professional necessity, a patient man. "I'm not selling the water," Ruth said finally. "We'll lease." There was a particular quality to what happened next, in the days that followed. Dale Kress drove out to the property on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the well was registered. Ruth had called him, which she had not expected to do, because she thought he should see it. He walked the east pasture and looked at the well casing and the new cover they had fitted, and he stood there for a while without consulting his tablet. "I owe you an apology, Ruth," he said. It was not a long speech. It did not need to be. Dale Kress was a good-faith man who had made a measurement error, and he knew it. "The animals found it," Ruth said, "not me." Kress looked at the 12 alpacas grazing near the well cap, and then at his boots, and then back at Ruth. "I'd like to bring a couple of my students out here," he said, "if you'd be willing. There are things about subsurface behavior in camelids I apparently haven't been teaching." Ruth said he could come when school started in the fall. Alicia Strand's fiber report came back 2 days later. The clip average across Ruth's 12 animals was 18.2 microns. 3 of the animals were at 16.8 microns, a grade that 2 mills in Vermont and 1 in Oregon paid $38 per pound for, against the collective's $9. Ruth's annual fiber yield at that price from 12 animals was approximately $14,600. Not a fortune. A living if the water lease was carrying the larger costs. Nate Poole had sold 19 animals in August and was running his remaining 21 head into fall with reduced margins and a debt schedule that had not adjusted itself for a drought year. He came by Ruth's property in October, not for any particular reason he named, and Ruth showed him the well and the fiber report and Earl's journal. Nate was a practical man, and he looked at the numbers steadily. "I should have asked you more questions," he said. Ruth leased the water right for $18,000 per year to a consortium of agricultural users, 2 valleys, over whose senior rights were insufficient for the dry year they were projecting. She paid down the remaining $4,800 in equipment debt she had carried since 2015. She did not expand the herd. She did not build infrastructure. She did not sign a contract with the Western Slope Fiber Collective. What she did was invite Megan to move into the farmhouse and take over the fiber processing records, which Megan did in November of 2022, after declining a job offer from a Denver consulting firm that paid 3 times what the alpaca operation was going to generate. She said she wanted to understand what Earl had understood, which was a different thing than what she had been trained to understand. She started with the journal. 3 neighbors came to Ruth's kitchen table that winter after word about the well and the fiber grades moved through the county. One of them was a woman named Dora, who ran 6 standard-grade alpacas 2 miles east and had been about to sell them. Ruth showed her the lab results and the breed lineage Earl had recorded and told her to get her fleece tested before she decided anything. Another was a young man named Curtis who had just bought a small property and was thinking about starting a herd. Ruth gave him Earl's processing notes and told him to start with 4 animals and watch where they stood. The third was Nate Poole. He sat at the table with his ledger and his remaining 21 head and asked Ruth if she thought he could find a specialty buyer for his better animals if he got them tested. She said she thought he could. She gave him Alicia Strand's number. Hatch died in February of 2023. He had been slowing since October, and on the morning he did not get up from the porch boards. Ruth sat beside him in the cold for a while, and the 12 alpacas moved along the east fence in the gray morning light, humming the way they always did. She buried him near the well, which seemed right. Earl's journal is on the shelf in the farmhouse now. Megan reads from it regularly, not for sentiment, but for data, cross-referencing the behavioral notes against her own observations and the micron records she has started keeping for each animal across each season. She is building what Earl was building, a record of what this particular piece of ground and these particular animals can do over time. It is not a fast record. It is not a record that fits on a contract schedule or a breed registry chart. There is something that separates the 2 kinds of knowing from each other, and it is not intelligence. Dale Kress was an intelligent man. Nate Poole worked hard and followed the data he was given and made reasonable decisions by the standards available to him. What separated their knowing from Ruth's was not that they were foolish and she was wise. It was that their knowledge was wide and current and confident, built on the averages of 1,000 operations across a region, and Ruth's knowledge was narrow and slow and built on 1 piece of ground across 3 generations. Wide knowledge is useful. It serves most people, most of the time. It is what you need to give advice, at scale to set contract prices, to draw a breed registry threshold and make it mean something across a county. What it cannot do is read a particular corner of a particular east pasture in a particular dry summer and know what is under the ground there. For that you need something else. Why? You need attention paid over years to a system small enough to know completely. And you need the patience to write it down even when no one is asking. And you need animals whose behavior has not been standardized out of them. What the 12 alpacas found when they stood at the northeast corner of that east fence was not a mystery. It was physics. Temperature differential, vibration sensitivity, the movement of water through sandstone at a depth of 34 feet. They were doing what their biology equipped them to do in a landscape that rewarded it. The mystery was why anyone thought the standard they failed to meet was the only standard there was. Ruth kept the water, she kept the animals. She kept the journal. What you measure and what is actually there are two different things. They always have been. The ground does not care about your metrics. What belongs to a place and knows a place endures in it. That is all Earl was ever trying to say. Dend, rah.